Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. The last 2017 Formula One car to be unveiled is this, the Red Bull RB13. The number 13, racing teams are very superstitious about it. Keen-eyed viewers will notice that in the older days of Formula One, when the cars were numbered by the order of the last complete season's championship position, there was no car number 13 in most years, as of course the number 13 is considered to be rather unlucky. Not so for Red Bull, who have decided to name their 13th Formula One car the RB13, in keeping with their standard nomenclature that goes all the way back to 2005 when they unveiled their first Formula One car, the RB1. The RB13, as I said, it is the last car to break cover for 2017, and all these shots that we have here today are actually taken from the track in Barcelona as the first day of winter testing has officially been completed. In this first shot, we see Daniel Ricciardo in the car shaking it down in one of its first ever laps around Barcelona in that test session. These shots are not of the highest resolution, so I do apologize. However, we can see the main details on this car, which I have to say is a little bit conservative from Red Bull, at least on the face of it. We're used to seeing these wild designs from Red Bull, and of course they have this absolute genius in Adrian Newey working as their chief technical director, chief of aerodynamics. However, the RB13 is a little quiet in terms of the big details that we're used to seeing from Red Bull. On this shot, however, we can divine some major characteristics of the car, namely, we have, of course, that ubiquitous pushrod front suspension, double wishbone, that is now on 100% of this year's Formula One cars. So, my prediction here, not a very risky one, but nonetheless proven correct that we have a double wishbone pushrod suspension on the front of all the 2017 Formula One cars. In addition, we can see on the rear, Red Bull, in keeping with their recent history, running a pull rod rear suspension. So a lot of cars running the pull rod and all the cars running the push rod on the front. Very nice. Another detail on the Red Bull, of course, that immediately strikes our eyes, shark fin. Big time shark fin on the Red Bull. Not the most complicated geometry that we have seen, however, big shark fin heading toward that rear wing there. Additionally, on this shot, we can see some turning vane detail, relatively simple in comparison to what some other teams have put together, namely Renault and Mercedes. These are actually quite simplistic on the face of it, and they harken us back to our review of the Sauber in terms of those single element, single plane turning vanes. The main detail, however, on the RB13 that does have people talking is right here, the nose section. Now, Red Bull, on the face of it, are running a thumbnail nose just like most of the other teams on the grid. However, if we look at the very tip of this nose, no, that is not a trick of the light. That is a duct cut right down the middle of the nose tip. And there have been some questions regarding the legality of having an open section in that nose tip. However, most interpretations out there are that this nose is in fact legal because it, technically speaking, has the same cross-sectional area as the thumbnail nose tip. However, it also gets around the idea of having to have a nose tip at all, because if we have that duct in there, it essentially nullifies the presence of that nose, and it allows the air simply to pass straight through it. Now, I do not think that there are any sorts of aerodynamic trickery going on here beyond what we can actually see. If we look at the rear side of this nose tip, at least what we can see of it, you just see this little chin area that comes down, and again, I do apologize, this shot is not the best. However, that is telling me that the air quite simply is passing through that nose area and then blowing straight out the back of the nose, and therefore able to go up toward the midsection of the front end and start feeding toward the barge boards, and then later on, of course, the radiator inlets in this area, turning vanes, and then, of course, attach itself to the rear bodywork and go out to the rear of the car. But a very innovative nose tip design on the RB13, and they are the only team to be running such a device so far. This is theoretically something that could be copied by the other teams provided that they would be able to get that new nose section past the FIA crash test. Of course, the nose is the primary frontal crash structure, and therefore it does have to be able to resist a certain amount of force before deforming too much or completely being obliterated to such an extent that the FIA would decide that it is not race legal. However, Red Bull apparently are able to get around that with this interestingly ducted thumbnail nose tip, and more power to them. I do like it when a team tries something new, and even though we don't see too many really wild details on this Red Bull, that nose tip is certainly one to remember. And on this next shot, coming to us courtesy of F1 Fanatic and XPB Images, we can see the RB13 once again from the front, but from a slightly different angle, again out on track at Barcelona. We can get a little bit better view now of the details on the front wing. It's a relatively simple front wing compared to everything else that we've seen, namely the McLaren, the Mercedes, even the Williams has run a little bit more of an intricate, interesting front wing than we're seeing so far on the Red Bull. However, we can see some pretty decent flap detail going on. We'll highlight this in yellow so it contrasts against the dark bodywork, but from this angle anyway, we can see, of course, the main plane section of the wing, and then we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at least flap elements on the main flap sections of the wing. Additionally, we have these cascade elements here where we can see some additional geometry going on. I like that there is an interesting stepped profile in these cascade elements. Obviously, you can see that the inboard cascade is a bit higher than the outboard. So, of course, a whole lot of wind tunnel and CFD work has gone into designing that. The end plates themselves, however, we see a relatively simplistic design, kind of similar to what we've seen on the Toro Rosso. Of course, Red Bull and Toro Rosso very much sister teams. They have the same name in two different languages. However, that's about where the similarities end. They're running the same engines, more or less. Of course, the Renault engines, Red Bull badging their Renault engines as Tag Heuer. However, they are built and manufactured by Renault. And you can see that this end plate design is somewhat similar to the simplistic one we've seen on the Toro Rosso. However, two different design offices for those teams, and as we can see, two very different interpretations of the 2017 regulations. Additionally, on this shot, as we zoom in, we do get a little bit pixelated, unfortunately, but we can see along the right side of the car screen left, we can see the profile of the floor pretty much entirely flat here on the RB13, with the exception of the extreme rear, just in front of the rear tire, right in this area. It sort of curves downward just a little bit, at least from this angle, right before the rear tire comes in. So about like that sort of profile. I've exaggerated it a little bit, however you can get the overall sense of what that geometry is. Interesting detail. We cannot tell from this shot, however, if they are running those turning vanes that we've seen on a whole bunch of other cars so far in this section of the floor. Again, this could very well be launch spec and they don't want to show all of their cards yet, but Red Bull so far, a relatively clean-cut car. Interesting. And on this next shot, we get a profile view of the RB13. Again, we're going to get a little bit pixelated, but you can see the very square profile of that shark fin in this shot. There's really no sculpting to it. It's just a straight up and down perpendicular angle running from the top surface of that fin and then down the vertical side here near the rear wing. Very interesting design, very interesting to see that they've not sculpted this section like a whole bunch of the other teams have. Additionally, we can see the profile of the rear wing end plates angled rearward, just as we have seen on pretty much all of the other cars, and also just like all the other cars, they are following a profile that is roughly like this. We come down vertically, we turn inboard a bit, and then we come back down vertically. That seems to be the prevailing design for rear wing end plates in 2017. Not entirely sure why they have this roughly 45-degree S-bend in the end plate, but I do suspect that it has something to do with managing the turbulent airflow coming off of those rear tires, because they are just generating all kinds of drag. So again, you just want to minimize where that turbulence impacts the rear surfaces of the car and just get that air away as quickly as possible. This shot taken from a little bit of a distance, so it's a little bit difficult to divine any further detail on it. However, you can just get a sense of the overall attitude of the car. We're not exactly at 90 degrees to the side of the car, but we can see from this shot that Red Bull are running quite a substantial amount of rake in this car. We can draw a line, of course, from the bottom of the T-tray to the ground, and then we do the same from the rearmost section that's visible to us anyway, and we have a significantly longer line on the rear than we do on the front. So Red Bull joining the heavy rake club. Also interesting to note, I've been listening to some chatter about the Force India recently, and Force India apparently also going to be running an extreme amount of rake in that car. If we remember from the launch pictures, they displayed the car on an unlevel surface. They had the rear end jacked up asymmetrically, so it was a little bit difficult to tell what the actual attitude of the car is under its own weight. But apparently Force India are actually going to be running such an extreme amount of rake that they're concerned about the integrity of the front wing scraping along the track and bumping into curbing. So if that happens, they're going to have to make some adjustments, but it just shows overall the philosophy of trying to get that airflow to come around the car from the front, pass over the front end, and then of course reattach itself in this area and then work its way to the rear. And of course you're also routing air underneath simultaneously, and you want it to have a very, very smooth and high pressure profile underneath the car, so you can accelerate it through the diffuser and then of course out the back, giving us that rooster tail effect that we all know and love so very much. And on this shot, we see the RB13 again from the front, but also taken from above. So here we can start to divine more detail about the midsection and rear section of the car. Again, we can see very nice detail there on the front wing. We've seen this before, nothing really amazing to write home about, but you can also see here the packaging that Red Bull have in the midsection and then headed toward the rear. All of this wonderful, lovely space that they have to play with. So, of course, we can draw our triangle down here. We have the reference plane, and then we have the tire squirt area coming back to the bodywork, like so. And then, of course, we can draw our hypotenuse where the bodywork roughly meets up with the floor on the inboard side. So you've got all of this area to play with for the airflow to come in from the front and from the side and just scoop its way in toward that diffuser. And of course that is the rationale that everybody is going for, to then accelerate it up over the rear wing and then blow out and generate all of that wonderful downforce that we all love so very much. Additionally, on this shot we can see, and we're going to zoom in a little bit more here, again apologies for the resolution, however, we can see very similarly to Mercedes, we have this louvering ductwork slots, whatever you want to call them, in front of the rear tires on the Red Bull. So apparently Red Bull running a few different specifications of floor during the first day of testing, and this is the first one that has shown us these slots. Now, it's interesting to note that if we look at the ground below these slots in the shadow, you can see sunlight coming through the floor. So these are holes in the floor. Now, you're not allowed to have an enclosed hole in the floor, but you can have a three-sided hole. In other words, one that comes in from edge on exactly. So in other words, running in this plane here on the very edge of the reference plane, and then moves inboard like so. So you can have an open area of the floor running this way, but it cannot be a sealed hole. So in other words, you can't just cut a hole in the bodywork, say, I don't know, right about here, and completely enclose it. That is 100% not allowed. However, you can have open slots, open to one side, and that appears to be what Red Bull have done in that area. And on this next shot, we can see here, it's a very, very tight close-up look at the front suspension on the RB13. Of course, we can see the wishbones running across the top and bottom here with their nice geometry running into the chassis, in addition to the push rods coming off from the wheels up into the suspension pickup points. Very nice geometries there. However, what this shot also shows us is this little detail right in here. This, my friends, is an S-duct, and this is a detail that was hidden from view on those front end shots that we saw earlier from a little bit farther back. And the reason why that was hidden was because of this little fairing here running across the front section of that duct outlet that we can see properly in this section here. So very, very cool, very sly move from Red Bull in order to hide that outlet from prying eyes when looking at the car from straight on. Because if you look at the car from straight on, it basically just looks like it's a flat profile running from the tip of the nose to the cockpit, but it is not. There is an S-duct outlet up here. Very cool indeed. Now, we all know that an S-duct works by there being a similarly sized slot to this one, the outlet slot, on the bottom side of the nose cone someplace forward of this. However, remember that nose tip, and remember the duct that is in that nose tip. Now, I said on the previous shot where we could see the tip of the nose that I did not think that it had any sort of trickery going on with it. It looked like a very simple inlet and outlet on the same plane. The air's not really being directed in any particular way. It's just going straight through the nose, and it simply looks to be cutting drag and maybe accelerating some of that airflow into the middle section of the front end of the car. And of course, that would be running underneath this area here toward the barge boards. However, because there needs to be a slot on the bottom section of the nose to feed this S-duct, it is possible that the duct in the nose tip has something to do with directing the air toward whatever slot is on the bottom side of the nose to feed this S-duct, and then of course to get that air up through the top of said S-duct and start to run across the top of the chassis, thereby generating more downforce. Just a theory, all speculation. Of course, nobody except Red Bull themselves have any idea what's really going on with that nose tip and S-duct combined. However, it is very cool to see Red Bull, of course, being the only team to run that slotted ducted nose tip in conjunction with an S-duct that we have seen on plenty of other cars. So, very interesting design details on the Red Bull, despite there being an apparent lack of anything too glamorous. We don't really see big canard wings on this car, for example. The barge board design is relatively simple. We don't see a really extravagant, elegant shark fin. It's just basically a rectangular piece of carbon, very similar to what we see on the Force India, really. But they are running this very radical ducted front end. So who really knows what Adrian Newey's evil genius design mind is doing here? And of course I use the term evil genius very playfully. Adrian Newey is a great guy and, more importantly, an absolutely brilliant aerodynamicist. So whatever's going on in Adrian Newey's mind in designing this car is beyond my capacity to understand, at least right now, because we're seeing a design that on the face of it looks very simple. I mean, I would say even the Williams in some areas has more development, at least overtly, than this Red Bull does. However, the small details that we can see on this car are extremely intriguing, and of course we'll have to wait and see how the car goes during testing and at the first Grand Prix. And on our last shot of the RB13, we see a very nice rear view. Zooming in a bit, we can see just the effects of running that much rake on the car. Have a look at the rear ride height here. You can see clear off the ground in the step plane area. That's the lower section of the bottom. And then, of course, when we get to the reference plane, it's even higher than that. So very high rear end on this Red Bull, and of course looking at the car from the rearward direction here, that's just to get the air accelerated through the bottom and then shot up and out from the rear section of the car to generate all of that downforce in that rooster tail effect. Very, very cool. Very nice to be able to see something visually like that with a big change on the chassis attitude via that rake. Of course, we can get a little glimpse of the diffuser solution that Red Bull are running right here. We can see multiple vanes coming down from the top side of the floor like so, coming up to the step plane area here. It looks like there are at least 3 on each side. The lighting and resolution are not the best in this shot, but we can see at least 3 vanes coming down from the bottom of the floor there toward the ground. Very cool. We can't quite see where the starter hole here is, but I would venture to say it's someplace in this area, basically homologated, of course, just because, again, that is what the designers exploited in 2009 for the double and triple decker diffusers. Very similar to the Mercedes, we can see these very large open areas of the bodywork here. Again, the rationale probably being that they want to use that energized high pressure hot air from the radiators coming through the bodywork from this area here where our radiator inlets would be, and just use that flow to come out through the rear wing, and then of course expand outward like this and expand upward like this in that low pressure zone underneath the wing to generate some downforce. Of course, this also means that there's going to be a whole bunch of turbulence coming out of these cars, and what we have heard from some of the drivers today after the first day of testing, it's somewhat more difficult for these cars to follow nose to tail. This comes as a surprise to nobody because given the expansion of freedom in terms of what the engineers can now do with the aerodynamics, you're working the air that much harder than you were last year, and certainly a whole lot harder than they ever intended to do back in 2009 when we started to have these radical aero changes to improve overtaking. Improving overtaking is not what the rationale behind this latest set of rule changes was. They simply wanted to make these cars faster, namely 4 to 6 seconds per lap faster. And so far from the times we're seeing from Barcelona, the teams are sandbagging massively. The times that we're seeing are not much faster than they were in the Grand Prix last year. So I don't think anybody really wants to show their hand yet. But these cars are already faster than 2016, and they certainly will continue to get faster. I assume by day 2 or day 3, we could see maybe 3 or 4 seconds a lap faster than these cars were last year, so I certainly cannot wait to see that. Some of the videos that I've seen, particularly of Vettel going around turn 8 in the Ferrari, he is on the power straight away through that long right-hander, where in the last couple of years the drivers were just feathering the throttle all the way through. Those of you who have seen my recent video with the SF15T in Assetto Corsa going around Catalunya, you will see that I was feathering the throttle all the way through most of the corners. Not so in these 2017 cars, and of course I can't wait in the sim racing world to get my hands on something representative of what these cars are doing. But in terms of how you would drive something from 2004 to 2007, you can get back on the power straight away, and it certainly looks to be the modus operandi here in 2017 for the drivers. Absolutely loving that. Last little detail that I want to point out, just the exhaust arrangement coming out from the Renault Tag Heuer engine on the Red Bull, and you can just see triple exhaust there, just like we get on the actual Renault factory car. 2 exhausts on the outboard for the turbo wastegates, and then your larger central pipe for the turbine exhaust itself. Of course, the engine exhaust routed into the turbine to generate boost pressure. That's about all we have got for today, and the Red Bull RB13 and the 2017 Formula One car release reviews. I thank you all so very much for watching all of these reviews. They've been a lot of fun to make, and just discovering all the details on all of these cars with you, sharing my thoughts, hearing your thoughts. I'm actually absolutely loving the dynamic that it's created, and certainly I am going to be looking to do more features like this as testing continues and as the season gets on. So I'm absolutely loving this, and I'm loving all of the great reception that you guys have given me. So thank you very much for that. Continue your engagement, continue your support. I certainly appreciate it very, very much. Until next time, Ferrari Man 601 again saying thank you very much, and we will see you soon.